I'm 70 years old, and this morning my only son shoved me so hard I hit the kitchen counter, just because I asked his wife to please smoke outside instead of right next to my face. He called me a dried-up old fool and told me to mind my own business. She just stood there grinning, saying it was about damn time somebody taught me my place. I fell. My reading glasses flew off and shattered on the tile. And as I knelt there on that cold floor, picking up pieces of broken glass with shaking hands, something clicked inside me. Something final. For 15 years, I put up with this because I believed that's what family meant. For 15 years, I kept my mouth shut about what I actually owned. For 15 years, my son never suspected what I truly had, or who'd been carrying this household on his back all along. But 20 minutes after that shove, I made one phone call, and everything changed forever. My son was convinced I was some helpless old man barely hanging on. He was dead wrong. Now let me take you back to how this morning started. The kitchen smelled like Sunday breakfast. Collard greens simmering low and slow since dawn. Fried catfish still warm in the cast-iron skillet. Because Marcus Washington had been up cooking since 5 in the morning, just like he'd done every single day for the past 15 years. He stood at the sink washing dishes, looking out through the window at the November morning, where frost still clung to the grass in the backyard, and the bare branches of the old magnolia tree swayed in the cold wind. He was thinking about how winter was coming fast this year, and pretty soon he'd need to pull down those heavy coats from the top shelf of the hallway closet. The water ran hot, almost scalding, but he liked it that way, because the heat eased the arthritis in his hands that had been aching worse and worse these last few months, especially at night when he tried to sleep. Behind him, he heard the familiar click of a lighter, and Marcus smelled cigarette smoke even before he turned around. Jasmine, his daughter-in-law, sat at the kitchen table with one leg crossed over the other, smoking and flicking her ashes straight into her half-empty coffee cup. She was 41 years old with sharp features and a kind of cold beauty that never offered warmth, only cut deep when you got too close. She'd never tried to hide how she felt about her father-in-law. To Jasmine, Marcus was like an old piece of furniture, something outdated and useless that should have been hauled to the curb years ago. Marcus felt his chest tighten immediately. He'd been dealing with asthma for 15 years, ever since Ruth passed away. The doctors told him it was partly stress-related, that sometimes grief settles in your lungs and won't let you breathe right. He pulled his inhaler from his shirt pocket, held it up so she could see it, and spoke as softly as he could manage, trying not to sound demanding or disrespectful. "Jasmine, sweetheart, would you mind taking that cigarette out on the back porch? My asthma's acting up real bad this morning. It's hard for me to breathe when there's smoke in the air. I'm not trying to tell you what to do. I'm just asking as a favor." Jasmine didn't even glance in his direction. She took a deeper drag, blew the smoke toward the ceiling, and replied in that specific tone of absolute contempt Marcus had been hearing for years. "This is my kitchen too, Marcus. If you don't like it, you can leave." Marcus wanted to speak up. He wanted to remind her that legally speaking, it wasn't exactly like that the kitchen and the whole house belonged to him on paper. But he stayed silent, just like he always did. He turned back to the sink and kept washing dishes, trying to take shallow breaths so he wouldn't start coughing, trying to make himself invisible. Right at that moment, Terence walked into the kitchen. His son, his only son, his own flesh and blood. The boy he'd raised, educated, supported through college, helped get his first car. Terence was 44 years old and worked as a supervisor at a construction company downtown. Over the last few years, he'd started to remind Marcus more and more of a man, carrying something heavy on his shoulders, but refusing to admit the weight was there. That morning, Terence had already woken up in a foul mood. There were problems at work. His boss was riding him hard about deadlines. Jasmine was demanding a new SUV, and life in general seemed deeply unfair to him. Terence caught the tail end of his father's words and stopped in the doorway. His face twisted into that look Marcus knew all too well, that scowl of irritation that could turn into full-blown rage in seconds. "You at it again?" Terence asked, his voice dripping with venom. "Always with the asthma drama. Every single damn day. Jasmine's got the right to smoke in her own house." "Son, I was just asking her if—" Marcus started to explain, but he didn't get to finish. Something snapped inside Terence, like a wire pulled too tight. He stepped toward his father, his face contorted with anger. Marcus saw it happening in slow motion, his son's hand coming up, shoving hard against his shoulder. He didn't have time to brace himself or even raise his hands to protect his balance. "Shut your mouth. You smell worse than the damn cigarettes anyway. You know how sick we are of you around here?" The shove hit Marcus hard. His hip struck the edge of the counter, and he went down, his knees buckling beneath him. His reading glasses flew off his face, hit the edge of the table, and the lenses exploded across the tile floor with a soft, terrible tinkling sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. The pain in his hip was sharp and immediate, but even worse was the other pain, the one that stabbed deep inside where his heart was supposed to be. Jasmine laughed. Not just a smirk or a chuckle. She actually threw her head back and laughed out loud, saying with clear pleasure, "It's about damn time somebody put you in your place, old man. How long were we supposed to put up with your whining?" Marcus lay there on the cold kitchen floor, staring up at the ceiling. He was 70 years old. He'd raised that boy who was now standing over him with clenched fists. He'd spent sleepless nights when Terence was sick as a child, rocking him, singing to him, praying over him. He'd worked 2 jobs to put him through college at Morehouse. He'd sold his daddy's old Buick to help with the down payment on Terence's first apartment. And now that boy, his son, his own blood, stood there without even thinking about reaching down to help him up. Terence was breathing hard. And slowly the reality of what he'd just done began to show on his face. But instead of regret, something else appeared. Something like self-justification. He kept telling himself he was right, that it was his father's fault, that the old man had pushed him too far with his constant victim act. "Get up," Terence grunted, turning away. "Quit the drama." Marcus pushed himself up slowly, fighting the dizziness. Then he stood, forcing his knees to stop shaking, forcing himself to stand tall. He bent down and began picking up the remains of his glasses, placing each shard carefully in his palm as if they were something precious, something that could still be fixed somehow. Jasmine stubbed out her cigarette in the coffee cup, stood up, and said with a smile, "Come on, Terence. Let him clean up his mess. At least he's useful for something." They left the kitchen together, and Marcus was alone. He stood there motionless for several seconds, holding the broken glass in his hand, staring at the doorway where his son and daughter-in-law had just disappeared. Something changed inside him at that exact moment. Something shifted and locked into place with an almost audible click. He'd been enduring this for 15 years, convincing himself it was normal, that all families had problems, that his son was just tired from work stress, that Jasmine simply didn't understand him or his generation. For 15 years, he'd been lying to himself. But now, standing in that kitchen with a swollen hip and shattered glasses in his hand, Marcus finally saw the truth clearly. This wasn't a family. It never had been. It was something else entirely. Something ugly and cruel that he'd only been calling family because he was terrified of being alone. He walked slowly to his room. That tiny space at the end of the hallway they'd assigned to him when he moved in after Ruth died 15 years ago. It was the smallest room in the house, barely more than a converted storage closet. It held a narrow twin bed an old dresser with 3 drawers, and a knit stand with a lamp. On the wall hung a single photograph of Ruth, his late wife, looking at him with that soft, knowing smile, as if she wanted to tell him something important. Marcus sat down on the edge of the bed and just stayed there, staring at the wall. He felt his hip throbbing and knew a bruise was already forming, deep and purple. Everyone's going to see it tomorrow, he thought distantly. The neighbors would notice and ask questions. He'd have to lie again and say he slipped on something, just like he always did. Then he remembered something. A business card he'd received about 3 months back from a young attorney who'd come to the building regarding a neighbor's estate matter. That attorney, a sharp woman in her late 30s, had stayed to talk with him a bit longer than necessary, and Marcus, without really understanding why at the time, had told her more than he probably should have. He told her about his son, who could go weeks without speaking to him directly. About his daughter-in-law, who treated him like he was invisible. About how he felt like a stranger living in what was legally his own home. The attorney had listened carefully, really listened, and given him her card. "If you ever want to get your affairs properly organized, Mr. Washington, you call me," she'd said. "Sometimes getting your legal documents in order helps get your whole life in order." Marcus pulled that card from the knit-stand drawer where it had been sitting all these months, and looked at it with his aging eyes. Without his glasses, the letters were blurry, but he already knew the number by heart. He'd been looking at it almost every night before bed for weeks, thinking that someday he'd make the call. That day had finally arrived. He took out his old flip phone, the one Terence always called ancient, and told him to throw away and get a smartphone already, and he dialed the number carefully. The ringtone seemed too loud in the silence of the small room. "Holmes and Associates, Attorney Patricia Holmes speaking. How can I help you?" "Good morning, ma'am," Marcus said. His own voice sounded strange to him, calm and firm, like it belonged to someone else entirely. "This is Marcus Washington. You gave me your card about 3 months ago when you were here in the building. Do you remember me?" There was a brief pause on the other end, and then the tone became noticeably warmer. "Of course I remember you, Mr. Washington. Are you ready to move forward?" Marcus looked at Ruth's photograph on the wall. She was still smiling at him, and it seemed like she was nodding her head slightly, giving him permission, encouraging him forward. "Yes, ma'am," he replied quietly but firmly. "I'm ready. Could you come by today?" "Right now, if that's possible." He gave her the address, which she already had in her files, and hung up. Then he lay back against the pillow and closed his eyes. His heart was beating too fast, and he felt pressure building in his chest. But it wasn't the asthma this time. It was something else entirely. Something that felt very much like the first breath of freedom after years of suffocation. For the first time in 15 years, Marcus felt like his life was actually in his own hands. Like he was the one making decisions about his future, instead of just accepting whatever came his way. He stayed like that for several minutes, listening to the sounds of the house around him. From the living room, he could hear Terence and Jasmine's voices. They were watching television, talking about something trivial, laughing about some show. They'd already forgotten what happened in the kitchen. To them, it had been nothing more than a minor episode, an insignificant scene that meant nothing. They had no idea that this episode had just changed everything forever. Marcus got up from the bed and went to his closet. On the top shelf, hidden behind several old sweaters Ruth had knitted for him years ago, was a box. A plain cardboard box that nobody had ever asked about. He pulled it down carefully and opened it on the bed. Inside were documents. Many, many documents he'd been keeping for years without showing them to anyone. Property deeds, lease agreements, bank statements, investment records. The complete history of his real financial life. The part of his life his son knew absolutely nothing about. He spread the documents out carefully on the bed and began reviewing them one by one, checking that everything was in order, that all the paperwork was current and legal. The deed to the house they were living in, this very house, bore his name clearly. Marcus Washington, sole owner. He'd never transferred it to Terence, even though he'd half promised to do it a couple years back. Something had always held him back, some inner voice whispering, "Wait, don't rush this. First see what kind of man your son really becomes." Now he saw it crystal clear. Now he understood why that voice had been warning him. There were also the deeds to 2 other properties in Atlanta. One was a duplex over in the West End neighborhood that Marcus had been renting out through a property management company for years. The other was a small commercial building on Auburn Avenue that brought in steady income every month. The rent from both properties went directly into a separate bank account. An account in his name only, an account Terence knew absolutely nothing about because he'd never once asked his father about his finances, or if he needed any help. Terence was completely convinced that his father was surviving on nothing but a small Social Security check and was entirely dependent on him and Jasmine for housing and food. That false certainty had made Terence arrogant and cruel because he genuinely believed Marcus had nowhere else to go. Poor helpless old man without a dime to his name. Where's he going to go if we kick him out? Terence was about to find out just how wrong he'd been. Suddenly, a sharp, stabbing pain pierced through Marcus's chest, radiating down his left arm. He clutched at his heart, gasping. It was a strong, crushing pain, unlike anything he'd felt before in his life. He tried to inhale deeply, but the air wouldn't enter his lungs properly. Black spots began clouding his vision, and he realized with a strange, distant clarity that he was falling. But he couldn't do anything to stop it. The last thing he saw, before losing consciousness, was Ruth's face in the photograph on the wall. She was still smiling at him, waiting for him. The crash of his body hitting the floor echoed throughout the small house. For a few seconds, everything went silent. Then from the living room, Terence's irritated voice carried down the hall. What was that? He dropped something again, probably. Jasmine let out a short laugh. Maybe he finally tripped over his own feet. Just ignore him. He'll deal with it himself. But no other sound came from the bedroom. No movement. No voice calling out. Just silence. Terence waited another minute, and grudgingly got up from the sofa with an annoyed sigh. "I'll go check," he muttered under his breath. Don't want him breaking anything valuable in there. He walked down the hallway toward his father's room, pushed the door open without knocking, and saw Marcus lying motionless on the floor. Documents were scattered all around him in a wide circle, and his face held a strange expression, something between pain and an odd kind of relief. Terence single quotes S first instinct was irritation. Another performance for attention, he thought automatically. Another attempt to guilt-trip us into feeling sorry for him. But then he noticed that his father's chest wasn't moving. Or if it was moving, it was so slight he could barely detect it. And something cold stirred deep in his gut. "Dad," he called out cautiously, not moving from the doorway. "Dad, what are you doing down there?" No answer came. Terence stood frozen in the doorway, looking at his father's motionless body sprawled on the floor. Somewhere very deep down, a feeling that had been dormant for many years began to wake up. Fear. Real fear. He forced himself to take a step forward, and another, and finally knelt down beside Marcus. His hands were actually shaking when he reached out to touch his father's shoulder, and that trembling was completely unfamiliar to him. Terence hadn't felt genuine fear or powerlessness in years. He'd convinced himself he was always in control, always on top of every situation. "Dad," he called again, his voice coming out raspy and tight. "Dad, can you hear me? Open your eyes, man." Marcus didn't react at all. His chest barely rose and fell, so slightly it was almost imperceptible. And that shallow movement was the only sign he was still alive. Terence pressed 2 fingers against his father's neck, trying to find a pulse like he'd seen people do in movies. But he couldn't tell if what he was feeling was Marcus's heartbeat or his own, which was thundering in his ears like a drum. "Call 911. He suddenly roared toward the doorway, where Jasmine was now standing, watching with wide eyes. "What are you just standing there for? Hurry up and call." Jasmine jumped at his sharp tone, fumbled for her phone in her pocket, and started dialing with shaking fingers. Her usual confidence had completely disappeared while she made the call. Terence remained sitting on the floor next to his father, looking down at his motionless face and feeling something dark and suffocating rising inside his chest. It wasn't just fear for Marcus's life, or at least not only that. It was a different kind of fear entirely. Fear of what would come after. Fear of consequences. Fear of responsibility. Fear of what people would say and think when they saw that bruise forming on the old man's hip. 911, what's your emergency? "There's a man here who collapsed," Jasmine said quickly, her voice higher than usual, losing its usual edge. An elderly man, 70 years old, lying on the floor unconscious in his bedroom. "Yes, he's breathing, but barely. The address is 2847 Cascade Road, Southwest, Atlanta. Apartment on the 1st floor." While they waited for the ambulance, Terence sat by his father's still body, and for the first time in many, many years, he really looked at him. Actually looked at him as a person, not just an inconvenience. Marcus had aged dramatically. When had that happened? His hair had gone completely white and thin on top. The skin sagged loose on his cheeks and under his chin. His hands were covered in age spots, and the veins stood out prominently. His body seemed so much smaller, more fragile than Terence remembered. When did he get so old? Terence thought with a jolt of something like shock. When did that tall, strong man who used to carry me on his shoulders at the park, who used to fix everything that broke in our old house, who seemed invincible, when did he turn into this thin, trembling old man who's always complaining about aches and pains? His gaze fell on the papers scattered near Marcus on the floor, and almost without thinking about it, acting on pure instinct, he leaned toward them to get a closer look. But at that exact moment, the doorbell rang loudly. "That's the paramedics," Jasmine said, her voice shaky with relief, as she hurried to the front door. Terence stood up quickly, brushed off his knees, and with an instinctive, almost unconscious movement, he kicked several of the documents under the bed with his foot, pushing them out of sight. He didn't even fully understand why he was doing it. He just felt some urgent impulse screaming inside him that those papers needed to be kept away from anyone else's eyes. 2 paramedics entered the small bedroom. A young black man in his 20s, carrying a large medical bag, and a woman in her 50s with tired but intensely focused eyes and graying hair pulled back. The woman immediately knelt beside Marcus, checking him over with practiced efficiency, while the young man opened the medical bag and started pulling out equipment. "Cardiac event," the woman said after about a minute, addressing her partner in that clipped, professional tone. "Blood pressure's dropping fast. Let's get an EKG on him right now." Terence leaned back against the wall, watching them work, feeling completely out of place in that cramped room, useless and in the way. Jasmine stayed out in the hallway, and he could hear her on her phone already, probably calling one of her girlfriends to gossip about the drama that was happening. Suddenly, the female paramedic raised her head and looked directly at Terence. Her gaze was sharp, evaluating, professional, but also deeply suspicious. And under that scrutiny, Terence felt distinctly uncomfortable, like she could see right through him. "You're his son?" she asked. It wasn't really a question, more like a statement. "Yes, ma'am," Terrence replied, his mouth suddenly dry. "Marcus Washington, 70 years old. He's got asthma, uses an inhaler regularly." The paramedic nodded slowly, but continued looking at him with that same intense focus, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And that bruising forming on his hip and the mark on his arm," she said carefully. "How did those happen?" Terrence's throat went completely dry. He swallowed hard and blurted out the first thing that came into his head. "He fell," he said quickly, maybe too quickly. "I guess when he got dizzy or had the attack or whatever. I just found him on the floor like this." The paramedic didn't respond to that, but something definite changed in her expression, in the set of her jaw. She turned back to Marcus and continued working. But Terrence saw how she paused for just a second to very carefully examine the bruising, feeling the area gently with her fingers, noting the pattern dot at that moment. Marcus groaned softly, and his eyes fluttered open. His gaze was cloudy, confused, disoriented. He didn't seem to understand where he was or what was happening around him. He tried to sit up, but the paramedic held him down gently but firmly. "Stay still, sir," she told him in a calm, authoritative voice. "You lost consciousness. We're paramedics. We're here to help. We're going to figure out what happened to you." Marcus blinked several times, slowly, and gradually his gaze began to clear and focus. He looked at the paramedic, then at the young man with all the equipment, and finally his eyes found Terrence, who was still leaning against the wall, looking pale and shaken out when Marcus's eyes met his son's. He didn't look away or close his eyes in shame or fear. He looked directly at Terrence with a strange new calm that Terrence had never seen in his father's face before. It was unsettling. "How are you feeling, Mr. Washington?" the paramedic asked gently. "Can you tell me what happened? Do you remember?" Marcus looked at her for several long seconds, as if carefully weighing exactly what he was going to say, measuring his words. "I had a pain in my chest," he finally said, his voice weak but steady. "Got nervous, felt dizzy, and fell down." The paramedic leaned closer to him and lowered her voice, though Terrence still managed to catch every single word from where he stood. "Mr. Washington," she said quietly but very clearly, "that bruising on your hip isn't consistent with a simple fall. I've been doing this work for 30 years. I know exactly what defensive injuries look like, and I know what it looks like when someone's been shoved or struck. Someone hurt you. Do you want to tell me what really happened?" The silence that followed those words became thick and heavy, almost tangible in the small room. Terrence felt his heart beating wildly in his throat. His hands were sweating. He wanted to run, to be anywhere else but in that room, trapped and exposed. Marcus looked at his son for a long, long time, studying him intently, as if seeing him clearly for the very first time in his entire life. Then he slowly looked back at the paramedic and spoke in a low but completely firm voice. "I fell," he repeated. "I tripped on something and fell down. That's all that happened." The paramedic held his gaze for several more seconds, clearly not believing him, searching his face for any sign he wanted help. "Are you absolutely sure about that?" She pressed gently. Marcus nodded once, definitively. "I'm sure." Terrence exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding the whole time. His father had just covered for him. The same father he'd shoved to the ground not even an hour earlier, had just lied to protect him from consequences. He should have felt overwhelming gratitude in that moment. But what he actually felt was something very different and much more complicated. A strange, uncomfortable mixture of shame and resentment, as if he'd been caught in a lie, even though technically his father had backed up his. The paramedic pulled a card from her uniform pocket and placed it, deliberately on the nightstand where Marcus could easily reach it, "This is my personal card," she said, looking directly into his eyes with meaning. "I'm Maya Richardson. If you need help, any kind of help at all, you call me directly. I mean that, Mr. Washington." Marcus looked at the card, then back at her face, and a very slight, barely visible smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Thank you, Miss Richardson," he said quietly. "I appreciate that. I'll keep it." The next half hour filled up with medical procedures and questions. They ran an EKG, took Marcus's blood pressure multiple times, checked his oxygen levels, and gave him some pills to dissolve under his tongue. The young paramedic asked him detailed questions about what medications he took regularly, what chronic conditions he'd been diagnosed with, whether he had any allergies to medications. Marcus answered each question with patience and precision, his voice getting stronger as the minutes passed. Terence stood against the wall listening, and with each answer, he felt a growing sense of shock and shame. He was discovering that he didn't know even half of what his father was telling these strangers. He didn't know Marcus had been dealing with high blood pressure for the past 5 years. He didn't know his father took 3 different medications every single morning. He didn't know about the stomach issues that meant Marcus couldn't eat anything fried or too spicy anymore. He'd been living wall to wall with this man for 15 years and knew practically nothing real about him. About his health, his struggles, his daily pain. Finally, Dr. Richardson announced that Marcus's condition had stabilized enough that hospitalization wasn't immediately necessary. But he absolutely needed complete bed rest for at least a full week, followed by a mandatory appointment with a cardiologist as soon as possible. "Is there someone here who can properly take care of him?" she asked, turning to look directly at Terence with that same evaluating gaze. "He shouldn't be alone. He needs monitoring, help with meals, making sure he takes his medications on schedule." "Of course," Terence replied too quickly, his voice coming out defensive. "My wife and I live here with him. We'll make sure he's taken care of." Dr. Richardson fixed him with a long, steady look that made Terence feel like a child caught lying to a teacher. "Fine," she said finally, her tone making it clear she had serious doubts. "Total bed rest. No stress whatsoever. No arguments, no conflicts. No emotional upset of any kind." She emphasized those last words in such a deliberate way that even Terence couldn't miss the message she was sending. The paramedics packed up their equipment and headed toward the door. Dr. Richardson paused at the threshold and looked back at Marcus one more time. "Remember what I said, Mr. Washington," she told him meaningfully. "You call me if you need anything at all." After they left, the house fell into an uncomfortable silence. Jasmine appeared in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest. "So he's going to live?" she asked with barely concealed annoyance in her voice. "For a minute there, I thought we'd need to start making funeral arrangements." Terence actually flinched as if she'd physically slapped him across the face. "Shut up, Jasmine," he snapped at her, surprising both of them. "Just shut your mouth." Jasmine's eyebrows shot up in genuine shock. Terence never talked to her that way, never contradicted her, and certainly never told her to be quiet. She stared at him for a long moment, then turned on her heel and walked back toward the living room without another word. Terence stood in the narrow hallway between his father's room and the rest of the house, not knowing where to go or what to do next. He felt like he should go back in there and talk to Marcus, say something, maybe even try to apologize. But what was he supposed to say? Sorry for shoving you down? Sorry for calling you a dried-up old fool? The words stuck in his throat like broken glass dot in the end. He turned around and headed back to the living room, back to Jasmine, back to the television, back to that comfortable numbness where he didn't have to think too hard or face anything difficult. Marcus lay in his narrow bed, listening to his son's footsteps fade away down the hall. He wasn't particularly surprised that Terence didn't come in to check on him or ask how he was feeling. 15 years had been more than enough time to learn not to expect affection, care, or even basic courtesy from his own son. He turned his head slowly and looked at the knitstand. Next to Dr. Richardson's card sat the other one, the one from attorney Patricia Holmes. Marcus remembered he'd called her just before the heart attack hit. She'd said she would come as soon as possible. She was probably on her way right now. He sat up carefully, moving slowly to avoid triggering another wave of dizziness or chest pain. The documents he'd scattered across the bed before collapsing were now mostly on the floor, some kicked partially under the bed by Terence. He began picking them up one by one, making sure everything was still there, that nothing had been taken or lost in the chaos. The deed to this house where they all lived, the deed to the duplex property in the West End, the deed to the commercial building on Auburn Avenue, the lease agreements, the bank statements showing the account balance. Everything was there. All of his real life, the financial reality he'd kept hidden from his son and daughter-in-law all these years, remained intact and documented. Marcus looked up at Ruth's photograph on the wall, the one constant presence in this room that had witnessed everything. I should have done this a long time ago. Ruth, he murmured, speaking to her like he often did when he was alone. You always told me I was too soft with that boy, that Terence walked all over me, and I just let him. You were right about everything, baby. You always were. Ruth smiled at him from the photograph, frozen in time at age 52, and he could almost hear her voice saying, "About damn time you woke up." Marcus Washington. From the living room, the sounds of Jasmine's voice reached him, sharp and complaining. She was talking to Terence about something, probably blaming him for the morning's events, making him feel guilty and small. She'd been doing that for years, tearing him down bit by bit, and Terence had never had the strength to stand up to her. Marcus remembered clearly the first time he met her, almost 20 years ago now. Terence had been 24, fresh out of college, working his first real job, and he'd brought home this beautiful girl with cold, calculating eyes. Ruth had read Jasmine immediately, seen right through her surface charm to what lay beneath. That girl's going to be poison for our family. Ruth had told him that very first night after Jasmine left. She's going to turn our son into someone we don't recognize. Back then, Marcus hadn't wanted to listen. He'd believed that young love was sacred, that parents shouldn't interfere in their children's choices. He'd thought Jasmine would soften over time, that love and family would change her. Now he understood that Ruth had been exactly right, as she was about almost everything important. Jasmine hadn't softened. She'd gotten harder, colder, more demanding. And she'd pulled Terence down with her into a life built on resentment and materialism and contempt for anyone they considered beneath them. The doorbell rang, and Marcus heard Terence walking to answer it. Voices in the entryway, surprised, tense, questioning. Then footsteps coming down the hall toward his room. "Dad," Terence's voice came from just outside the bedroom door. "There's a lawyer here. Says she has an appointment with you." Marcus placed the documents carefully in a folder, stood up slowly, and straightened his clothes as much as he could. His legs felt shaky, but he forced himself to stand straight and tall. It was important to appear strong right now, to show that he was in complete control of this situation. "Send her in," Marcus replied in a clear, firm voice. "And you come in too, son. This concerns you directly." Attorney Patricia Holmes was exactly as Marcus remembered her from 3 months ago. A tall, elegant woman with a straight posture and sharp, intelligent gray eyes that seemed to see through people's pretenses to the truth underneath. She wore an immaculate dark blue suit with a crisp white blouse. Her hair was pulled back in a professional bun. She carried herself with that kind of unshakable calm possessed by people who've spent decades handling other people's secrets and other people's money. Behind her came a younger man. probably in his early 30s, carrying a leather briefcase. Her assistant or associate. "Mr. Washington," she greeted him, stepping into the small room and taking a quick assessing look around. "I came as quickly as I could. You said on the phone it was urgent." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, gesturing toward the only chair in the room. "Please, have a seat. This conversation is going to take some time." Terence stood frozen in the doorway, looking from his father to the attorney and back again, clearly not understanding what was happening. He was visibly unsettled, and that confusion made him defensive and uneasy. Over the past 15 years, he'd grown completely accustomed to his father, being as predictable as sunrise, always the same, always passive. He'd always known exactly what to expect from the old man. And suddenly, everything had gone completely off the expected script. "Dad, what's going on here?" Terence asked, trying to keep his voice steady and controlled. "Why do you need a lawyer? You just had a heart attack. You should be resting, not doing business." Marcus looked at his son, and in that look there was no anger or bitterness or desire for revenge. There was only the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of someone who has carried too much weight for far too long and has finally decided to set it down. "Precisely because of that, son," Marcus answered calmly. "Because I almost died this morning. That made me realize something very important. Life can end at any moment, without warning, and I need to get my affairs properly in order while I still can. Come all the way in and listen carefully. This is going to interest you very much." Terence walked in slowly, moving like a man walking toward something dangerous. He leaned against the wall and crossed his arms defensively over his chest. That posture was supposed to convey confidence and control, but it only revealed how nervous he actually was. Jasmine appeared behind him, leaning against the doorframe with undisguised curiosity on her face. "You can listen too, Jasmine," Marcus said evenly. "This involves both of you equally." The attorney took her seat and opened the leather folder she'd brought with her. The young assistant stood ready with a legal pad, prepared to take notes or hand over documents as needed. "Mr. Washington," Patricia Holmes began in a professional, businesslike tone. "3 months ago, when we first spoke, you expressed a desire to properly organize your estate and put all your legal affairs in order. I've prepared all the necessary documents based on the information you provided me at that time. But before we proceed any further, I need to confirm that your decision is final and that you fully understand the implications." Marcus nodded firmly. "Final and irrevocable." Terence shifted uncomfortably against the wall. "What decision?" "Dad, what exactly are you talking about? Explain what's happening here." Marcus looked at him in silence for several long seconds, observing this 44-year-old man, his only child, his own flesh and blood, and trying to find somewhere in that hard face the little boy who used to run into his arms, shouting, "Daddy! Daddy!" with pure joy and love. But that child was gone, lost somewhere in the past. In his place stood a stranger with cold eyes and a closed heart. "I'll explain everything now," Marcus finally said. "Sit down if you can find a spot. This isn't going to be easy for you to hear." Since there was nowhere else to sit in the cramped room, Terence stayed leaning against the wall. Jasmine pressed closer to him, putting a hand on his shoulder in a gesture that was probably meant to be supportive but looked more possessive. Attorney pulled out the first document and laid it on the bed, directly in front of Marcus, where everyone could see it clearly. "Let's begin with the primary asset," she said in that neutral, professional voice. "The deed of ownership for the property located at 2847 Cascade Road Southwest, Atlanta, Georgia. This single-family house where we are currently sitting." Terence actually smiled, a smile of relief and vindication. "Finally," he said out loud. "It's about damn time. I thought you were never going to decide, Dad. You should have put this house in my name years ago, like you promised. Attorney Holmes looked up slowly and regarded Terence with a completely neutral, unreadable expression. I don't think you understand the situation, Mr. Washington, she said carefully. This document is your father's current deed of ownership. This house belongs entirely to Mr. Marcus Washington. It always has, and it still does right now. The smile slowly melted off Terence's face like ice in the sun. What do you mean it still does? He stammered, his voice going thin and high. Dad promised to transfer it years ago. We had an agreement about that. Marcus shook his head slowly, definitively. I told you I intended to do it, yes. And I did intend to, at the time. But there was always something that held me back, some feeling I couldn't quite explain or understand. Now I know exactly what it was. I was waiting. I wanted to see what kind of man you would actually become, what kind of character you would develop, whether you'd be worthy of the responsibility. Terence went visibly pale. His arms tightened across his chest defensively. And what's that supposed to mean? He asked in a hollow voice. That now you've decided to punish me for what happened this morning in the kitchen. Is that what this is about? Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked at his son for a long time, as if wanting to memorize every feature of his face, as if this might be the last time he'd see him. For what happened in the kitchen, Marcus repeated slowly, tasting the words. Is that really what you're calling it, son? You shoved me to the ground. You called me a dried-up old fool. Your wife laughed while I was lying there hurt. That's not just something that happened. That was a choice you made. A line you chose to cross. Jasmine flinched slightly, but said nothing. Her eyes narrowed, and she looked at her father-in-law with barely concealed hatred and growing fear. I lost my temper, Terence said through gritted teeth. I know I was wrong. I admit that. But this whole circus with lawyers in the house, that's taking it way too far. The attorney cleared her throat quietly. If I may continue, she said politely but firmly, there is considerably more to review. She pulled out 2 additional documents and placed them on the bed next to the first one, fanning them out so all 3 were clearly visible. Deed of ownership for a duplex property located on James P. Brawley Drive in the West End neighborhood. 2 units, each approximately 950 square feet. Current fair market value estimated at $240,000. She paused to let that sink in, then continued. And deed of ownership for a commercial building located on Auburn Avenue Historic District. Ground floor retail space with office space above. Approximately 2,400 square feet total. Current fair market value estimated at $380,000. Both properties also belong entirely to Mr. Marcus Washington. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Terence stood completely motionless, frozen in place, his face cycling rapidly through shock, confusion, disbelief, and back to shock again. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Jasmine made a small choking sound, like someone had just punched her in the stomach. What? She finally managed to whisper. What properties? Where did they come from? Marcus folded his hands calmly in his lap and spoke in an even, measured tone, as if he were commenting on the weather outside. The duplex I bought 30 years ago, when Terence was still in middle school. Your mother and I saved every extra dollar for years. We wanted our son to have something solid of his own when he grew up, real property he could build a future on. Then we bought the Auburn Avenue building about 20 years ago with money from some patents I'd secured. I've had both properties rented out through a management company all this time. The income goes into a separate account that you never knew existed. Why? Terence whispered, his voice breaking. Why didn't you ever say anything about any of this? Did you ever ask? Marcus countered quietly, and for the first time, a hint of real bitterness crept into his voice. In these 15 years since your mother died, did you ever once ask me how I was managing financially? Whether I had enough money for my medications? Whether I needed help with anything at all? Terence couldn't answer. His silence said everything. Marcus continued, his voice steady and calm. You were absolutely convinced I was just a poor old man barely surviving on a Social Security check, completely dependent on you and Jasmine for everything. That false belief made you arrogant and cruel, son. You thought I had nowhere else to go. No options, no way out. You thought I'd put up with anything because I was trapped here. He paused and looked directly into Terence's eyes. But I do have options. I always did. I just didn't want to use them because I believed family was supposed to be above money, above pride, above everything else that matters in this world. I was wrong about that. Jasmine finally found her voice again, stepping forward with her face twisted in rage and disbelief. There's got to be some kind of mistake here, she spat out. Where would you even get the money for properties like that? You were just a regular engineer your whole working life. Nothing special. Marcus turned to look at her and offered a slight, sad smile. Just a regular engineer, he repeated slowly. Yes, that's what I was. But I was also an inventor, Jasmine. Back when the industry still paid good money for innovative ideas, I secured several patents for manufacturing processes and safety equipment. I sold licenses to 3 major companies. With that money, I bought the properties, and there was plenty left over for investments. Attorney Holmes pulled out a bank statement and placed it on top of the property deeds, right where everyone could see the numbers clearly. The current balance of Mr. Marcus Washington's primary savings and investment account, she read in that same neutral, professional tone, is approximately $127,000. Plus monthly rental income of approximately $2,800 from the 2 properties, after management fees and expenses. Jasmine actually swayed on her feet like she might faint. She grabbed Terence's arm hard for support, but Terence wasn't in much better condition himself. His face had gone gray. Almost $130,000, Terence murmured in shock, staring at the bank statement. And 2 properties worth over $500,000 together. Dad, why were you living in this tiny room? Why were you putting up with all of this if you had that kind of money? Marcus stood up slowly from the bed. He moved carefully, still weakened from the heart attack. But he stood straight and tall, and in his posture something new had appeared. Something that had been hidden away for far too long. Dignity. Self-respect, power. Because I wanted to be near my family, he answered simply. Because after Ruth died, our old house felt enormous and empty and full of ghosts. Every room reminded me of her. I thought I'd be better off living close to my son, that maybe we could support each other through the grief. I believed you loved me, Terence, that you just had trouble showing it the way some men do. I made excuses for every harsh word, every look of contempt, every moment of disrespect. I told myself it would get better eventually. He walked slowly to the small window and looked out at the gray November sky. I paid for everything in this house, he continued without turning around. Did you really think it was your salary covering all the bills? It wasn't. Every single month for 15 years, I left cash in an envelope on the kitchen counter for groceries, utilities, repairs, property taxes. You thought you were the one earning everything, carrying the financial burden. But it was my money the whole time. That's not true, Jasmine protested weakly, though her voice had lost all its usual confidence. Terence earns good money at his job. Terence earns a decent salary, Marcus admitted, turning back to face them. But not nearly enough to maintain the lifestyle you both insist on living. A new SUV every 3 years. Expensive vacations twice a year. Designer clothes. Restaurants several times a week. Premium cable packages. All those things you consider necessities. Where exactly did you think all that money was coming from? He looked directly at Jasmine. I know you've never liked me. I know you've always seen me as a burden you couldn't wait to get rid of. I've overheard your phone conversations about putting me in a nursing home, about how I'm taking up space, about how I smell like old age in medicine. I heard you call me useless and worthless. I heard every single word, Jasmine, because these walls are thin, and you never bothered to lower your voice. Jasmine stepped back as if his words had physically struck her, her face flushing with a mixture of shame and anger. And I endured it all, Marcus continued. I endured it for my son, for the idea of family, for the hope that maybe one day things would change and get better. But this morning, that hope finally died. When Terence shoved me to the ground and you laughed, something inside me broke permanently. And I realized I can't live like this anymore. I won't. Attorney Holmes cleared her throat gently. Mr. Washington, if you'd prefer, we can postpone this discussion until another day. After your medical episode this morning, it would be completely understandable if you needed more time to rest. Marcus shook his head firmly. No postponement. Today. Right now. I've waited long enough already. 15 years too long. He turned back to face Terence and Jasmine directly. I'm selling this house. The buyer is already lined up and ready to close. The paperwork is prepared. All that's missing is my signature. What? Jasmine whispered, her voice coming out strangled. You can't do that. This is our home. We've lived here for 15 years. You can't just kick us out. This is my home, Marcus corrected her calmly but firmly. It has always been mine legally, and I can do with it whatever I choose. You'll have 30 days to find another place and move out. That's more than fair, more than generous, considering how I've been treated. Terence had been silent, but now he found his voice raw and desperate. Dad, where are we supposed to go? We don't have money saved up for a down payment on another house. We can't afford to rent anything decent in this neighborhood or anywhere close to it. That is no longer my problem to solve, Marcus replied, and there was no cruelty in his tone, only exhaustion and finality. For 15 years, I solved all your problems, paid all your bills, made your life comfortable and easy. Now you're going to have to figure things out for yourselves, like grown adults should. He looked at Attorney Holmes and nodded once. Let's sign everything. I want this finished today. Patricia Holmes spread the documents out on the small dresser that Marcus used as a desk for reading at night. Her assistant pulled out a blue ballpoint pen and held it ready. Everything proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency, as if this were just another routine real estate transaction and not an act that was completely overturning a family's entire existence. Terence, still leaning against the wall, watched with wide, disbelieving eyes as his father signed the papers that were taking away his home, his financial security, his comfortable future. He felt like he should do something, say something, find some way to stop this nightmare from happening. But he couldn't move. His feet seemed nailed to the floor, and his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. He could only stand there paralyzed, watching his whole life crumble. First document, Attorney Holmes read aloud. Sales contract for the property at 2847 Cascade Road Southwest, Atlanta, Georgia. Buyer is Mr. Sterling Vance, real estate investor, prepared to close within 7 business days following execution of this preliminary agreement. Purchase price, $195,000. Jasmine let out a sound somewhere between a moan and a scream. $195,000. The house we've been living in for 15 years is worth almost $200,000. And all that money is just slipping through our fingers right now. Wait, Terence said suddenly, pushing off from the wall and taking a step forward. Wait, please, Dad. Let's talk about this. Let's talk calmly. Just the two of us, without lawyers or anyone else. We're family. We can work this out." Marcus raised his head and looked at his son. In his eyes, there was no rage or hatred or desire for revenge. Only the infinite, crushing sadness of someone who has spent years waiting for words that never came. "Family," he repeated, testing the word on his tongue. "This morning in the kitchen, you shoved me to the ground. You called me a dried-up old fool. Your wife laughed at me while I was hurt and humiliated. That's what you call family, son?" "I went too far," Terence admitted, his voice breaking with emotion. "I was terrible. I know that. But that's no reason to destroy everything we've built over so many years together. Dad, I'm begging you. Give me one more chance. I promise I'll change. I swear it." Marcus remained silent for a long moment, just looking at him. In that silence, heavy as stone, lay all the broken promises of the past. "How many times have you promised to change, Terence?" he finally asked quietly. "I've lost count over the years. After the first time you yelled at me in front of dinner guests. After you forgot my birthday 3 years running. After I heard you tell Jasmine I was a burden you wished would just die already. Every single time you promised things would be different. And every single time I believed you because I wanted so desperately to believe you. Because you're my son, and I love you more than anything in this world." He stood up and walked slowly toward Terence, stopping just one step away. Father and son stood face to face, separated by a chasm of 15 years of unspoken pain and unshed tears. "But this morning, you crossed a line that can't be uncrossed," Marcus continued. "And it's not even about the physical violence, though that was bad enough. What really broke me was seeing the contempt in your eyes, the complete lack of respect for the man who gave you life and raised you and sacrificed everything for your future. That's when I finally realized I've been lying to myself for years. This isn't a family. It never was." "Dad," Terence whispered, tears starting to fill his eyes. "Dad, please don't do this." Jasmine pushed forward, shoving past Terence. Her face was contorted with a mixture of fear and rage. "You have no right to do this to us," she hissed at Marcus. "We spent 15 years taking care of you, putting up with your illnesses and complaints and constant presence in our lives. We deserve this house. You owe it to us." Attorney Holmes raised one eyebrow but remained silent. Her assistant took a small step backward, trying to make himself invisible. Marcus looked at his daughter-in-law, and in his expression there was neither hate nor contempt. There was something closer to pity. "Taking care of me," Marcus repeated softly. "Jasmine, in 15 years, you never once brought me a glass of water when I was sick in bed. You never asked how I was feeling. You never said a single kind word to me. You smoked directly in my face, knowing I have severe asthma. You called me names behind my back. You talked to your friends on the phone about when I would finally die, so you could have my room for a walk-in closet." Jasmine opened her mouth to protest, but Marcus raised his hand to stop her. "I heard everything," he said firmly. "Every conversation, every insult, every cruel joke. The walls here are very thin, and despite what you believe, my hearing is still quite good. I heard it all and stayed silent because I kept hoping you'd eventually accept me as part of this family. That never happened, and it never will." Jasmine turned desperately to Terence. "Say something? He's your father. Talk to him. Stop this." Terence raised his head and looked at her, and in his eyes flashed something new. Painful, bitter clarity. "What do you want me to say?" He replied in a low voice. "That he's wrong? But he's not wrong, Jasmine. He's right about everything. About both of us." He looked back at Marcus. "I didn't know you could hear us through the walls," he admitted. "I thought when you closed your door, You couldn't hear anything from the rest of the house. I thought? He stopped, unable to continue, choking on his own shame. Marcus nodded slowly. I know what you thought, son. You thought I was a senile old man who didn't notice anything anymore. That hurts worse than the physical pain, worse than being shoved or called names. Knowing my own son thought so little of me. Attorney Holmes cleared her throat again. Mr. Washington, shall we proceed with the signatures? Yes, Marcus said firmly. Let's finish this. He returned to the dresser, picked up the first document, and reviewed every line carefully, every detail and clause and number. Then he took the pen and signed at the bottom of the page with a clear, steady hand that didn't waver or hesitate for even a moment. Jasmine made a strangled sound and lunged toward the dresser, trying to grab the paper, but the assistant was faster. He stepped smoothly between them, blocking her path. Please step back, Mom, he said politely but firmly. Any attempt to interfere with a legal proceeding can be considered coercion and carries serious consequences. Jasmine jerked backward, breathing hard, her eyes throwing sparks of pure fury. But she remained silent. Finally understanding the game was truly lost, Marcus signed the second document, then the third. Attorney Holmes stamped her official seal on each page, and the heavy thud of that stamp hitting paper echoed through the small room, like a judge's gavel pronouncing final judgment. Last document, the attorney announced, placing one more paper in front of Marcus. Change of primary residence registration. Effective immediately, you will be officially registered at your property on James P. Brawley Drive, Unit A. Marcus signed that one too, without hesitation. Done, he said quietly, setting down the pen. It's finished. He stood and looked at his son and daughter-in-law one final time. They stood side by side, but an enormous rift seemed to have opened between them. Jasmine was looking at Terence with undisguised blame and resentment, as if this disaster was entirely his fault. Terence was staring at the floor, unable to raise his eyes to meet anyone's gaze. You have 30 days, Marcus said. Find another place and move out. The new owner is willing to wait that long, but not a day more. Dad, Terence whispered brokenly. Where are we supposed to go? We don't have savings. We're not going to be able to find anything we can afford. Marcus looked at him, and something like pity stirred briefly in his chest. After all, this was still his son, the baby boy he'd rocked to sleep, the child he'd taught to ride a bicycle, the young man whose college graduation had made him cry with pride. But that boy had been lost somewhere along the way, replaced by this weak, bitter man who'd allowed his wife to poison his heart. You're a grown man. Terence, Marcus finally said. You're 44 years old. It's past time you learned to solve your own problems. I've been doing it for you for far too long. That ends today. He turned to Attorney Holmes. Thank you for your help and your patience with all of this. I appreciate it more than I can say. That's what I'm here for, Mr. Washington, she replied warmly. If you need anything else at all, you know how to reach me. She gathered up all the documents and placed them carefully in her leather folder. Before leaving the room, she paused and looked back at Marcus. You did the right thing, she told him quietly, meant only for his ears. Don't ever doubt that. Marcus nodded, and she left with her assistant following close behind. The front door closed, and the house fell silent once more. The silence lasted only a moment before Jasmine exploded. She whirled on Terence, her face twisted with rage. This is all your fault. She screamed at him. Because of your stupid macho act in the kitchen this morning. If you hadn't put your hands on him, none of this would be happening. We've lost everything because of you. Terence raised his head slowly and looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. Because of me, he said slowly. Yes, it's because of me. But you laughed, Jasmine. You stood there and laughed while my father was on the floor. You said it was about time someone taught him his place. You were happy when I heard him." She opened her mouth to respond, but found no words. She just stood there, opening and closing her mouth silently. Marcus looked at them both with a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Finally, he was seeing his son wake up, seeing Terence actually look clearly at what his life had become and who he'd allowed himself to become. "Terence," Marcus said gently, "I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing it because I have no other choice left. If I stay here, you'll keep treating me the same way. The insults will continue, the disrespect, maybe even violence again. And one day my heart won't survive it." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "I want to live, son. I'm 70 years old, but I'm not ready to die yet. I have good years left in me. And to really live, to have any peace or dignity, I have to leave this place. It's the only way forward." Terence listened, and his face changed completely. The defensive anger melted away. Replaced by raw understanding and shamed-out Marcus pulled an envelope from his pocket and placed it on the dresser. "Here's the attorney's contact information and copies of everything we signed today," he said. "I wish you both well. I genuinely do. But my time of sacrifice is over." He opened the bedroom door and stepped out into the hallway. Before walking away, he turned back one final time. "Goodbye, son," he said. "Or maybe it's see you later. That part is entirely up to you and what kind of man you choose to be from this day forward." Marcus walked down the hallway toward the front door, and with every step, he felt something tremendously heavy lifting from his shoulders. The air seemed lighter, cleaner, easier to breathe. His chest opened up, and he took a full, deep breath for the first time in what felt like years. Outside, the November sun was breaking through the clouds, and Marcus stood on the front step for a moment, looking up at the sky. He pulled out his phone and made one more call. "Dr. Richardson? This is Marcus Washington. I wanted to thank you for your help this morning, and I wanted you to know I took your advice. I'm making changes. Big ones." When he hung up, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 long years. He felt free. He felt alive. He felt like himself again. The next morning, Marcus woke up in his new home, the duplex unit on James P. Broly Drive. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and he could hear birds singing outside. He sat up slowly, carefully, and looked around at the empty room that would soon become his new beginning. On the knitstand sat Ruth's photograph, the first thing he'd unpacked and set up in his new place. "We did it, baby," he said softly to her image. "Finally, after all these years, I found my courage again. You'd be proud of me." Ruth smiled at him from the photograph, and Marcus Washington smiled back. For the first time in 15 years, he was truly smiling. Smiling like a man who had finally chosen himself.